Welcome to Aspen Leading Edge. I'm Patty Roberts from St. Mary's University School of Law, and today's guest is Dan Filler. He is Dean and Professor of Law at Drexel University's Thomas R. Kline School of Law, and he is in his 8th year of deaning. It's a position he started in January 2017. Welcome, Dean Filler.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. One, because I'm looking forward to talking about your experience deaning so far. But let's start with the beginning of the Drexel University Kline School of Law, because I know that you helped design and implement the vision that first started the law school. So it's a young law school. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how that evolved?
Yeah, I've been incredibly lucky to have a job in academia that is kind of a little quirky and atypical. So I joined Drexel University a little before the law school opened in October, the end of October of 2005, with the plan to start in the summer of 2006. I only was doing consulting at that point. I was still on the faculty in 05-06 at the University of Alabama. And we would have these retreats deciding things like, what should a 1L curriculum have? What should a curve look like? Do we teach things over one term or two? And it was incredibly fun to ask questions about things that had always been handed down from on high before. So that was tremendous fun. And then we got to create a law review. We got to kind of build out organizations. But maybe one of the best parts was working to create a culture of faculty, a culture of staff, and a culture of students. Can't really engineer that, but you try to do things that pointed in a direction. And I think we've had a lot of success in all sorts of ways in these last 17, 18 years. But I think one of the ones that I'm most happy with is that we've built a really strong community that is very caring, and that feels like a lot.
Well, sometimes that can be the most essential thing, right? All law schools have the 1L curriculum and have, generally a similar approach to teaching, but community really can be a difference maker for our students. Were there other things that came out of those early conversations that remain distinctive about a Drexel Kline legal education?
Well, one of the things that was important from the beginning was to kind of dovetail with the approach of Drexel University, which is a co-op school, cooperative education. So the university students typically take 5 years and leave 3 times for 6 months to work, typically in a paid employment. We were not shooting for that model, so we implemented a kind of corollary. Our co-op program, and we call it the co-op, has students taking a semester of highly immersive externships if they choose. And about 2/3 of our students do choose the co-op. And what they do is they work about 25 hours a week. And one of the things that was a relatively novel choice on our part was that these externships could happen in typical sites like public interest organizations or judicial chambers, but they could also happen with for-profits at firms, in-house. And that has turned out to be a great kind of opportunity for students because it gives them the kinds of experiences that most of them are going to have. It also worked really well for a young law school because we did not have alumni to blaze a trail and to build reputation. So the way that most employers came to learn about our students initially was through co-op. And so instead of having to wait 2 or 3 years after our first class graduated for us to get kind of returns from the employers, we were getting feedback and they were getting a sense of our students by our 2nd year of operation. And I think that really did contribute in part to our pretty vast liftoff as a law school.
So this co-op that you have with basically an externship or internship of 25 hours a week for the students who choose to do it, is it similar to those externships that we would have at other schools? And does it have requirements that are similar? For instance, the reflection piece and the classroom component?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar except insofar as it is more intense than most schools' externships. It absolutely has a reflection piece. It has a course called Learning Practice Seminar that's required to be taken concurrently with it. Maybe what makes it a little different is our investment level is pretty high. So we have a co-op faculty that really invests a lot of time, both in working with the students and their partner placements, as well as teaching the course. We also have one-on-one placement advising. We have a very large book of partners. And so the director of our program sits down with every single person interested in co-op for half an hour, trying to match them. We have a curriculum built around it, and the folks in our program have presented around it a number of times that has a midpoint meeting that students design with outcomes. And then we have a pretty rich post-co-op survey from employers, which we then feed back into the law school to figure out how we're doing along the metrics we've identified as what we want to teach our students. So it turns out to be a great feedback loop for us outside of just final exams. In the middle of law school, we're getting a lot of data about how we're doing in terms of training our students to do the things we say we want them to do.
I imagine that will give your students a head start when and if your jurisdiction moves to the next gen bar exam, because they'll be doing the kind of work that I understand will be more readily tested on that new exam.
I think that's true. I hope that's true. I hope it'll give them a good start. I don't want to act like we're the only ones out there. The ABA requires a relatively substantial number of experiential hours. And so students at most law schools are doing clinics or externships or simulations that ought to be teaching them that. We can obviously debate about how many hours ought to be required. The ABA is debating that question themselves. But to some degree, I guess we'll figure out if we're doing enough of it based on how our students do in a next-gen bar.
Exactly. So I'm interested with your university's approach to undergraduate education, that they plan on 5 years and they have this co-op model that's different from yours, but perhaps contributed to inspiring what you're doing at the law school. How does the law school work to integrate itself with the university or not?
So one of the things that marked the creation of our law school was a certain degree of skepticism from the rest of the university about creation of a law school. And anyone who has been part of starting a law school, and a few law schools obviously have started in the last couple of decades, I think a common phenomenon is that the rest of the university looks at the law school as a college of special snowflakes, because law schools are a little bit different in various ways than many other colleges. And so if the law school has existed for 100 years, when I was at the University of Alabama, people were not saying, why is your teaching load what it is? Why do you not have to get grants, etc.? But at a new school, skepticism abounds. So for us, from the beginning, we understood it was really important to be at least partially integrated or engaged with the university. And at founding, we had 3 concentrations that were designed to be sort of in parallel with university priorities. So we had an intellectual property concentration because engineering was important, business and entrepreneurship to match onto the business school, and health law to match onto the relatively newly acquired Drexel University College of Medicine, as well as the nursing school. So these were, sort of conceptual pathways. It wasn't immediately obvious how the law school would map on. What has happened, though, is that we have areas where we've built up some expertise, and we have many more areas of expertise now. And we've tried to find ways to integrate in a variety of different fashions what's going on at the law school with the rest of the university. And that does relieve a little bit of the strain of people concerned that the law school is trying to be special. But honestly, it's atypical, I think, of at least where most law schools were, maybe ever, and certainly until recently, because law schools really have typically been very separate. And as a new school, we just didn't quite have the same luxury, I think, that other schools have had. So, for example, we recently hired 2 additional faculty with expertise in law and technology, with knowledge around AI, cybersecurity, data privacy, government transparency. And the goal for that was manifold. One was we just believed it was important for the curriculum that law students will greatly benefit from having our ability to offer that, part of our Center for Law and Transformational Technology. But another priority of it is that it allows us to engage so much of the university research that is going on in these sorts of areas. We want our faculty to be co-PIs on work that's going on in cybersecurity. We want our faculty to be on committees that are shaping research policy. we want our faculty to be in conversations with the people in engineering and computing who are designing the things. I think one of the things we've really seen is that a lot of the scientists are really deeply moved and motivated by a problem, but they don't necessarily think about sort of the secondary effects of solving it. And as lawyers, we are sort of articulating society's voice and concern. And so I think it would be a great thing, and it's what we're working towards, to have sort of the Drexel research enterprise informed both by technological solutions, but also by forethought around policy and social implications of the work.
Do you find willing participants on both sides of the campus, from law faculty and from university faculty?
This is always a challenge. I'm not going to minimize the challenge of it. I think the answer with some of our more junior people is absolutely. And I think partly that's because culture is changing. More of these folks have doctorates, for example, so they've lived an interdisciplinary reality. I think for people with technology, they see that it's such juicy problems exist if you can be working in tandem with others. On the other side of the campus, I think one of the things that works in our favor is that a lot of the big funders, NSF, on related things with respect to some of the health stuff, NIH, they look very favorably on interdisciplinary teams. So adding the legal voice only increases odds of having grants be given. I think that helps, but it's a real, just as when we started the law school, we were building a culture, there is a level in which I recognize we're culture building and we are not where I hope we are in a decade. I hope that in a decade, there's much more of a sense that we need to be working together. One thing I'm really proud that we did, we put on a law review symposium, which looks very law-y, but it was really in tandem with our College of Biomedical Engineering, and it was around legal implications of neurotech, the technology that's been developed particularly for people, for example, with ALS, to help people who can't talk get ideas out by reading and writing brainwaves. It's a daunting technology, but there's a lot of money that's floating around. I know Musk was putting money into it. I think Meta is putting money into it. And as you can imagine, reading and writing brainwaves has big social implications. So this was a great chance to bring in our engineering folks, to bring in some people from arts and sciences who do ethics and philosophy, as well as law professors. And I think it made visible to people on campus that we have something to say to the conversations and projects that they're working on.
Well, I applaud your efforts to do that. I think sometimes law schools are seeking those interdisciplinary partners, but historically there is, among some law schools, an interest in remaining siloed and not being integrated as much with the university. But there are many benefits, as you have described. And you've gone even further at Drexel Kline by starting an undergraduate degree in law. You want to share a little bit about that?
I feel like this is a really logical place for some law schools, at least, to go. It's not a simple task, but we know that, for example, in Europe, lawyers are trained with an LLB. That's a different education than American undergraduate institutions provide. That is typically a lawyer training, more technical education. The United States obviously has some legal studies programs, business schools. There's a law and society strand. You sometimes see kind of a socio-legal studies. So there is a little bit of touch on law in the undergraduate curriculum. But we thought it would be interesting to engage students on something they are actually interested in, which is knowing what the law is. That is some of the pieces of a first-year style curriculum, and integrating that with some of the socio-legal studies and some of the kind of law and business pieces. So in essence, what we do is we form a strong core of a substantive law education, not a practice education. So for example, we teach a course called Common Law. We teach a course called Public Law, Legal Reasoning. So we're getting them sort of the deeper understanding of kind of how laws happen in the United States, but not with anything like the depth of law school. And then we're going off and we're having conversations about everything from tax policy to tenants' rights. It's been great. The curriculum has a bunch of law courses, but it integrates courses from throughout the university. we require every student either to have a minor or a double major in another field. And the theory on this comes out of that same logic that you've heard when people talk about the T-shaped lawyer, where a lawyer has the breadth of legal knowledge they know across a lot of areas, but the T is that one area of depth in which they can be very specialized, and it could be a distinct area of practice, securities law. It could be some particular area of the world. It might be an expertise in technology. We think that for undergraduates, that really makes a lot of sense because we don't expect all of our students to go to law school. So, for example, we have people who are nursing majors who are also law majors. We have people in engineering. We have people in public health. And when you stop and reflect about taking a job with a BA in public health or a BA in engineering or business of entertainment, you realize, yeah, it would make a lot of sense to have some law. So we built that program out with the goal of integrating. And that also is designed to situate our students and our law school, again, at a crossroads within the university.
This is a pretty recent degree addition, I know, for Drexel Kline. How popular has it been?
So it's very recent. We are bringing our second round of freshmen in, and we've had some internal transfers. We expect to have, and we're a little smaller than a couple other schools have this that have had larger programs, but we're pleased. We expect to have 100 majors by the fall and 50 to 100 minors by the fall. Now, keeping in mind that it's young, and we're a university that historically has not brought in tons and tons of students in the social sciences and humanities. Some of the, I think, larger state schools, I think we are the fifth or sixth law school in the country to have a program like this. I think some of the larger state schools have had even bigger programs than ours. I think the question everyone is asking, at least outside of the law school, is, are you cannibalizing other departments? That is, are there fewer political science majors because of it? We don't think that's happened here at the law school at Drexel Kline. We watch that pretty closely, but it is an issue of great concern. And that is when you try to start a program like this, there are a lot of faculty around the university who worry that this program has implications for their department. So that's just a piece of trying to start anything like this.
Sure. Well, that's a very impressive enrollment for your second class that you're bringing in. We just started in the middle of last year a business and law major out of our business school. And for the freshmen coming in, it's the second largest major this fall. I think it can be a distinction, right? It can be a reason somebody chooses your university over another if you have this pre-law major or minor available. So good luck as you continue that. Do you see that instead of cannibalizing, do you see that as something that could help universities with their enrollment also when you're looking at the demographic cliff that universities are staring down and the many stories that we read about colleges and universities closing and having huge deficits? How can a law school help in those scenarios?
So first of all, I think that universities that have law schools, similar to universities with medical schools, have a certain gravitas on the market. I think that schools like that have an advantage as being kind of seen as maybe more major players. For rightly or wrongly, I just think that that is part of how people see it. I think the opportunity law hasn't been traditionally an American discipline for undergraduates, and yet it's been and is especially now of great interest to high school students. So anything that you can have that puts the law school and puts the university where students' heads are is a huge advantage. I also think that the reality is we are in a very regulated society where most of the people who are involved in law do not go to law school. We just look everywhere. Anyone who's been on a job has had compliance. So there's just so much that touches on law. I think that that's something that people recognize. So it fits both interest and job, aspirations. So I think this is going to be a strength for universities that have law schools to be able to feature those law schools in a variety of different ways, because I think it makes us compelling places for 17 and 18-year-olds to take their next steps.
So let's talk about your deaning experience. Now, you've been a tremendous asset to me as a younger dean. I'm finishing my 4th year. You were going into your 8th year. I know we had COVID together and all of us could wax poetic about that crazy situation that we went through. But how have you seen the job change, absent COVID, obviously, over those 8 years? And what do you look forward to as you start to move towards that decade of experience?
It's funny. There is an imagined day when deaning of law schools was a simpler job, when there were so many people wanted to go to law school and it wasn't nearly as competitive a space. I mean, COVID is only one piece of the broader story, I'd say, which is that being dean has been hard and stressful work for years now. And although I was not the dean of the law school in 2009, 10, 11, when the recession was hitting, those were tough years, and it required law schools to figure things out. And that's when a lot of the Master of Legal Studies programs began, as people were looking to keep supporting their law schools. What I think I've seen is that it continues to be the case that successful deans are flexible, whether it's about modality or the programmatic options or everything that's happened in this past year in the political environment, figuring out how to navigate day to day. I think deans to succeed in the long haul find a way to find some balance in their life. I will tell you, the job is super stressful. I'm sure you experience it the same way. And I don't know that I perceived how stressful it was before I was the dean. Even as an associate dean, there's just something different that happens when you know at the end of the day, it's the president who's going to call you up at 9 o'clock at night with who knows what. So I think that a lot of it has been sort of a recognition that you got to take care of yourself. You've got to have sounding boards from outside the narrow world you live in, which is why so many deans support each other. And I also think for me, it has been true that constantly finding new curiosities, even within the law school, is important, whether it's developing new programs or doing a retake and reimagination of fundraising. The same thing was true for me as an associate dean, which was I was an associate dean for a very long time, for 10 years. And the dean I worked under, Roger Dennis, really let me define my job. So I kept finding new things to define. And I think the same is true for a dean. I can't imagine being a dean for a decade who's doing the same old things in years 2 and 3 as in years 8 and 9. So a lot of what I've done is I've worked on many more university initiatives, which sort of along the lines we talked about, it really has, I think, helped raise the profile of the law school within the university and keyed me in to understand better how we could plug into the university. So I think that's been a great aspect of my second sort of wave of time.
It's a very useful way to spend your time, right? As if it's going to boost up the law school and ultimately the university by having the law school be more involved. This job is certainly not for someone who wants the status quo, right? One of our colleagues talks about the surprise of the day, and there is a roller coaster component to having this position. But I think you're right. You've got to find things that keep it exciting, besides just the things that make it exciting because they are imposed on us.
Right. That's right. It's keeping some agency in the job, keeping yourself interested. And I know this isn't how every dean moves through the space. There are definitely people who feel like they're doing service to the school and they're putting in their 5 years and watching their watches to go back to the faculty. But there's so many different things that you get to do as dean if you choose to, whether it's working in sort of the national law school organizations, like the Association of American Law Schools or the Law School Admissions Council or, the various other groups now, or within the university. And that's one of the lucky things about having the job is there are lots of places that will welcome your bonus time. That is one of the only costs, is that the job will take pretty much full time just doing the minimal requirements. So it's excess, but that excess often gives you the energy you need to show up the next day.
Certainly. All right. In our final few minutes, I'd like to find out what your predictions are for the future of legal education in the coming decade.
I know I am sort of bracing myself for a couple of different things. One is I expect at some point we're going to see a little cooling of the legal market. We've seen bits of cooling, but we haven't seen a chill. So I think all of us are thinking about that, thinking about maintaining reasonable class sizes so we have better chances of placing our students, thinking hard about how to make sure our career offices are geared up for that. So I think we have to think about that. Another thing that we're all watching is the potential of a real decline in undergraduates, what sometimes is called the demographic cliff. And that's going to put more pressure on universities and by extension on law schools. And so I think it's going to be really essential that we understand that the universities may ask more of us than they have at times. If there's simply fewer students coming in, there's less revenue coming in. So I think law schools are going to be watching out for financial pressures. I think law schools have to be watching out for cyclical economy pressures, and then hanging out in the background, which we're all aware of, and I think everyone's kind of struggling to find the answer, are the twin elements of an increased presence of non-lawyers involved in practice and the rise of technology, which may sort of change the nature of the lawyer workforce. So there are the changes that will kind of be permanent changes like those. There'll be short-term shifts like around the economy, and we're going to see pressures from the rest of the university. I think there's no question that there will be plenty for deans to do over the next decade.
You're here. As far as all the things that are going on at Drexel Kline, thank you for sharing with us the progress that you all are making for such a young law school to have such tremendous success, and appreciate the conversation today, Dean Schiller.
Thank you so much for having me. It really has been fun.
Well, if you want to hear from additional thought leaders across the Academy, you can find more episodes on the Aspen Leading Edge podcast page or on your favorite channels of podcasts. Thank you for listening.